Okay, by now, hopefully everybody listening to this has become aware of the decision by the Colorado Supreme Court on December 19th, 2023, where they ruled that President Trump was not eligible to be included in the Republican primary in the state of Colorado. And if you like to learn about how all of this is scripted in advance, boy, do I have a video for you. Man, this stuff is wild. And I kind of don't even know where to start. But I suppose first we'll go back to January 6th, 2021, and President Biden's speech on what happened at the US Capitol that day. I'm not going to read his whole speech or everything that he said. The important part is up here in the title. It's not protest, it's insurrection. Biden delivers remarks on quote-unquote siege upon U.S. Capitol. From the very beginning, the actual day that it transpired, they knew what was going to happen 4 years later in terms of this agenda and how they were shaping it, to the point where they had Biden very specifically use the term insurrection in his speech that day. Why is that the case? Well, they knew that 4 years later, they were going to use the quote-unquote insurrection clause in the 14th Amendment to kick off the next leg of this thing that they're doing, to kick off the next stage of it. By having President Biden refer to it as an insurrection, that kind of filtered that word back into the public's perception in a way that that word wasn't there beforehand. Insurrection is kind of an ancient word. It's not used in everyday conversation anymore. It's a very particular, specific word referring to a very particular, specific event. And by Biden putting it back into the zeitgeist in the way that he did, and then, of course, all of the propaganda outlets run with that term as well, and it gets repeated over and over again when it is being referenced in relationship to what happened at the US Capitol, well, it becomes a familiar term. And now it's in the public vernacular to the point where President Trump engaged in an insurrection. They've been telling me this for 4 years. We should absolutely ban him from being on the ballot if this clause in the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution dictates no one engaging in an insurrection is eligible to hold any kind of office in the federal government. That makes perfect sense. For those of you who don't know, the 14th Amendment was a part of the Reconstruction Acts that came about after the Civil War in the United States of America, and specifically that insurrection clause in the 14th Amendment was designed to prevent Confederate soldiers or officers from holding office in the federal government as it was reconstituted, for obvious reasons, because there had just been this bloody war between the two sides, and they were painted as against the United States government, and logically then they were not considered viable candidates to be involved in the future of the country, at least until they removed that provision many years later with the Amnesty Act. But in the immediate aftermath of the war, they could at least sell that idea to the public. Like, hey, this is a good idea. Let's keep all of these people who engaged in a rebellion against the United States out of office. Because obviously, like many things, what happened during the Civil War and the Reconstruction period is much different than what the history books have written about it. And I don't have time to get into that right now. Maybe I'll attach something that gets into that after the video. I don't know. We'll see how long it goes. And I'll decide on that later. But obviously, from the very day itself, not only was this quote-unquote insurrection planned many years in advance and scripted, but they had the next stage of it in mind as well for the next election cycle. All the way back on the day that the original event happened, hey, we're going to refer to this as an insurrection because that's going to come into play much later when we involve Trump in the next election cycle after this current one where we're going to have him say that he thinks the election was stolen, and that's going to tie into QAnon and all that we have built along those lines, and that will further tie it into the domestic terrorist narrative that we are trying to build for the people that support this kind of thing. Indeed, we're conflating a domestic terrorist with an insurrectionist, so that eventually it culminates in this salient event where it can no longer be denied that these people are a huge problem and they must be dealt with. We have to change the way that this country itself is set up so we can deal with these people, because we're not dealing with foreign terrorists anymore. These are actual domestic terrorists that live down the street from you. I mean, we have to change the fabric of the country itself to deal with these people because they're Americans, you see? So along those lines, I typed in Colorado Supreme Court into my search bar to see what came up. And there is not a single story about what actually transpired with the 14th Amendment and how the court used that to justify its ruling. There's no details along those lines. No, what are the top stories that I get here? FBI investigating threats against Colorado judges. Denver police investigating threats against Colorado Supreme Court justices. FBI says it's investigating after reports of violent threats to Colorado judges. Threats against Colorado Supreme Court justices prompt FBI probe. Well, if the FBI is on the case, we're safe. My goodness. Anyway, I get story after story after story about threats against the justices who made this decision, which is reinforcing the very idea that I was just going into about how everyone who supports Trump is a domestic terrorist who is prone to violence, prone to storming capitals and engaging in mayhem and insurrection, right? They're priming people for this view of who these people are. The Trump supporters, that is. They've been doing this priming for many, many years. I mean, this goes all the way back to Waco, Ruby Ridge, Timothy McVeigh, which has always been the undercurrent that was propelling Alex Jones. And even Bill Cooper was a part of that as well. And Alex Jones kind of just stayed on the fringe from 2000 to 2010, and then he really entered the mainstream on the heels of Donald Trump and became a well-known public figure from around 2012 to 2020, which related to everything that he said about certain shootings and his support of Trump in general and his support of the protests that were scheduled for that day in January 2021. I mean, he was involved in a majority of the funding that brought everyone to the Capitol that day. He was a primary organizer of it, which was by design, of course. And that's why he was brought back into the public spotlight, as I went into in the prior video, with Tucker Carlson, right as Leave the World Behind was released. And this story about Donald Trump was about to come out on December 19th, 9 days later, after the interview with Tucker Carlson and his reinstatement to X by Elon Musk, which was on December 10th. Down here it says, the Denver Police Department said law enforcement responded to a justice's residence Thursday evening on what appears to be a hoax report. Everything checked clear, and we are continuing to investigate this report. Due to security and privacy considerations and the ongoing investigation, we are unable to provide any additional information at this time. So any kind of overt threat against one of the justices was probably called in by someone else so that they could run with stories like this. It probably wasn't a real threat at all. Now, some of the stuff that was written online might be similar, but I'm sure there were real people who were thinking, oh, here we go again. They stole the election from us in 2020, and now they're going to steal it from us again by trying to keep us off the ballot in the first place. So you can see how this is kind of an escalation of the election interference narrative that they built into the 2020 election, which was all by design, of course, to coincide with the, quote, stealing of the election, which would be the justification they needed to stage the January 6th Capitol incident, which played into the domestic terrorist narrative that they were trying to build into the future of this country as it relates to how we are viewed both internationally and domestically, how we interact with each other. It's actually kind of hilarious now where world leaders from other countries get on Twitter and say, oh, the United States can't say anything now because they have no credibility anymore. And it's like, yeah, that's by design. Again, you have to bring America way down if we're going to have a world government where every country is equal. And that's part of this process, is diminishing what America stood for and is in the eyes of the world slowly over time. And that's been done for years. Now, we're at the tail end of that strategy. But we are to the point where the United States' credibility is at an all-time low, given what it has engaged in. I mean, if you think about it from the international perspective, helping to fund the Ukraine proxy war, helping to fund the Israeli war, and then on top of that, having actual Supreme Court justices in a state ruling that a candidate can't be on a ballot. I mean, that's some stuff that you would see in other countries that the United States previously would have pointed their finger at and said, see, look, they're a banana republic. They're not a serious country. They're ruled by corruption. They don't have any kind of rule of law. And even if this is appealed to the Supreme Court and they say, yeah, hey, that's not the spirit in which the 14th Amendment is to be interpreted, this is overruled on appeal. Even if they do that, the damage has already been done by the act itself in terms of the credibility of the United States of America. So it's one thing after another that is designed to lower us in the eyes of the world. That's happening in the realm of the mind at the same time that it's happening in physical reality itself as it relates to our standard of living. So hopefully it's obvious now why they repeatedly escalated the language about what happened at the U.S. Capitol to make it seem like more than it actually was. Forget about the fact that it was scripted and a part of a plan. Just think about how they presented it. It's not a protest, it's an insurrection. They made it seem much, much worse than it actually was because it was always designed to play into both the domestic terrorist narrative that they had been building up until that point, and as a part of the larger script, they knew eventually they were going to invoke this insurrection clause much later down the line. And just to be clear here, because I know a bunch of different people with different levels of awareness are going to listen to this video, when I say they, I don't mean the Democrats. Okay, hopefully that much is clear. We're talking about something that goes back thousands of years, and that's being conservative. But anyway, I had a couple other headlines here that I wanted to get into that gets to the same idea here, where they are referring to it as an insurrection from the very beginning. This is from a CNN link, January 6th, insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. The Washington Post has a section dedicated to the January 6th insurrection, where they go into the stories that are constantly building into this narrative. Oh, and then this was from 2019. Justice Department quietly embraces the term domestic terrorism. Government's unequivocal labeling of El Paso rampage as terrorism was the latest example of recent change at DOJ. And when you think about it, this, as far as the timeline goes, fits perfectly into the agenda and the way that it has unfolded. President Trump runs for office and is elected 2014, 2015, 2016. Then from 2017 to 2019, they really pushed the QAnon narrative into the mainstream. And then 2019, you have the Department of Justice and other institutions start referring to ordinary acts of violence as domestic terrorism that don't have any political motive, at least out in the open when they transpire. And that change began the crescendo into 2021 and this major alleged act of domestic terrorism that they very clearly labeled as something worse than what it was. It's an insurrection. It's a siege. It's a rebellion. Because that type of thing plays into memos like this from the FBI and Department of Homeland Security, Strategic Intelligence Assessment and Data on Domestic Terrorism from October of 2022, where they lay out in great detail how this is the thing that they are the most concerned with. Domestic, homegrown, quote-unquote, terrorists. And the thing is, like I said, back in Waco, Ruby Ridge, Timothy McVeigh, that was viewed as something kind of on the fringe that was outside of the general population. But now, through the narrative that has been built, they are pushing this domestic terrorist narrative onto regular people. Now, if you just have a political opinion that isn't in line with the mainstream, you are an extremist yourself that is prone to being radicalized online and spreading misinformation and engaging in acts of violence eventually, like this insurrection at the US Capitol. Do you see how they escalated the rhetoric there in a very contrived and calculated way? And then you get to points like this, where it's just a local news article that says, hey, are you worried domestic terrorism will affect you or someone in your family? It's just wild stuff. This is from May of 2023. All of that flows seamlessly into an article like this now, on the edge of 2024, where they can say something like, we will vigorously pursue investigations of any threat or use of violence committed by someone who uses extremist views to justify their actions regardless of motivation. You see, the problem is we're in this stage now where anything, like I said, that is not in line with what we're supposed to think is considered extremist. And now you have the actual FBI, DHS, and police departments investigating regular people for potentially being quote-unquote extremist domestic terrorists because they're saying something that isn't in line with what they're supposed to be saying. Online threats against Colorado Supreme Court justices spiked following its divided December 19th decision, finding that Trump is ineligible to return to the White House under the Constitution's so-called Insurrection Clause. How very interesting, right, that the so-called Insurrection Clause is a part of the script when, like we went into earlier, President Biden used that word on day one. How very interesting, right? It's all just a giant coincidence, I suppose. That's what they would want us to go with. Oh, it's just a coincidence, man. Don't you know this stuff? It just happens, bro. Relax. Man, wild stuff. But hopefully you see how all of this ties into the last video on Leave the World Behind X and the 2017-2024 Great American Eclipse. And to that point, I'm thinking it's more and more likely that they will not put Trump back into the presidency because you could achieve the same result either way. And just looking at how they're positioning all of this in the narrative, it would seem more likely that they will somehow exclude Trump from the ticket altogether, or if he's on the ticket as the Republican nominee again, he will somehow lose the election. And then we'll have a revisiting of some type of January 6th event, except it'll be on a broader, larger scale, a more serious scale that's more violent and more in your face to the point where something like a Patriot Act 2.0 would be viable in response from the government. Because they've laid the foundation for the patsy, neo-Nazi, white nationalist, radicalized online domestic terrorist to be viable in the minds of the public. Oh, hey, I've heard about this for years and years and years now. Yeah, I'm sure those people are out there. That would make it easy to sell. In the same way that they sold Osama bin Laden as the person who orchestrated 9/11 from a cave in Afghanistan, right? So, it's the same template that they're using here. You just have to apply it in a different way. But that's seeming more likely to me now than him actually being reelected Hitler-esque dictator that they somehow turn against us and use in the way that they used Hitler in the overall agenda, because they could do that too, right? They could turn him into that kind of villain, which would justify a world war against him in the same way that they used it to justify a world war against Hitler, that created all the conditions they needed to establish many prongs of their agenda going forward at that time. It could go either way, and maybe it'll be something completely different that doesn't involve Trump at all. I don't know. I have no idea what the script actually is. I can only read it in both hindsight and then in terms of what they're building as the narrative in terms of how the public is supposed to view these things. I can only see them building that stuff, building the scaffolding, as it were. I can't predict anything that they're going to do. But see the patterns here. It only took a few days for them to go right into that domestic terrorist narrative following this Colorado Supreme Court decision, which is how you know it was a part of the script, because the script is domestic terrorism. That's the overall agenda. And anything that plays into that, you can be pretty sure was planned in advance. So had to cover that as sort of an addendum to the last video because it came out just a little bit after I recorded that one. I should have waited a little longer, but no worries. I got it in, and that's it for now. Later.